Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams for over 2 years now about the importance of the Holy Spirit in the lives of Christians. And the series for today is called The Biblical Flood, and this is part 4. So let's go ahead and get started. So the title of episode 4 is The Garden 2.0. Believe it or not, we are making progress. It is a tall order to come up with an interpretation of the early chapters of Genesis that fit both the text itself, also the wider biblical narrative, as well as what we find in nature as far as evidence is concerned. Another thing is that this text has been around for thousands of years. Over 3,000 years, and it's been studied by scholars for 3,000 years. So, who am I to come up with my own new interpretation of it? It is a tall order. I would also say that if a straightforward explanation existed that satisfied both scripture and the natural world, it would likely have surfaced already by now. That means that we have to take our time, and we have to carefully explore ideas that are even outside of the box, as it were. The fact that no fully satisfying explanation, at least to me, has emerged suggests that we have to move beyond conventional frameworks and think a bit more creatively. But that is why I have created all these constraints, guardrails to keep us from going off the text and out of the scientific world, as well as the premises, and I will also be introducing some speculations today. Now, maybe you're thinking, as I say that, don't we already have valid explanations? Why am I creating another one? I would say, I have looked, that's anecdotal, just myself, but I have, researched the subject seriously over at various times in my life. And I haven't found one that remains fully consistent with the biblical text, as well as being fully consistent with what we see in the natural world. I keep running into questions with the biblical text, for instance, like how did the ark accommodate every kind of land, animal, and bird? The ark was big, but there are a lot of different species of animals and birds. And what about the insects? Are those maybe considered as animals because they move around? Still, there are millions of species of insects. And then also, how did the animals come from distant regions like the Americas, for instance, that didn't even have land bridges? How do they, go all the way to the Middle East and then disperse again after the flood to repopulate the world and know where to go? And also from a scientific standpoint, where did all the water come from? Where is the evidence of a worldwide or even a large regional flood event? We know that there are other cultures. Basically, just about every major culture has some sort of flood event, but many of them may be referring to some sort of epic flood in their region. And the few that, like Gilgamesh, that seem to coincide with the biblical flood, those raise questions as well. They indicate that it was a large flood, but they don't indicate, they don't necessarily match up with like the shape of the ark and what was saved and the person of Noah. Some of those might have some explanations, but that's why I haven't personally found anything that I would consider a perfectly or fully valid explanation. Let's start with a review of the ideas that we've come up with thus far to narrow down the possibilities of what the flood was. I have introduced 6 constraints, but I also wanted to talk about, I guess, what I'd call a foundational constraint that I haven't actually enumerated as like number 1, but I think I've established by my channel itself. So first of all, it has to have scriptural integrity, whatever idea we come up with. Any idea must be consistent with the full witness of Scripture, even when passages appear to be in tension with each other. A natural coherence. Any idea must not contradict with observable structure of the natural world. while recognizing that scientific models are provisional and can be influenced by underlying, possibly anti-biblical assumptions. Supernatural allowance. God's direct, often miraculous intervention is obviously permitted. God can do whatever he wants. He has the power to do whatever he wants. But the explanation should not rely on unnecessary or ad hoc miracles and should remain consistent with the patterns of divine action seen elsewhere in Scripture. That's a difficult one to define, right? Because God can do whatever he wants. But we do see other examples of God intervening in miraculous ways. We spoke about things like the plagues of Egypt and the splitting of the Red Sea and the crossing of the Jordan. So those don't necessarily limit what God can do, but they do show or give an example of how God acts when he does decide to act miraculously. Historical awareness. Extra-biblical Jewish texts and traditions may provide context and insight, but they are not authoritative and are not binding on interpretation or any sort of hypotheses that we might come up with. That's important to this channel because I've often talked about the Midrash, the Mishnah, the Talmud, which is, the Mishnah and the Gemara, and also the pseudepigraphal books. So there's a lot of Jewish literature out there that we can draw from, but they are not authoritative. Okay, now back to constraint number 1. The text presents the flood as a real event. So that excluded any sort of symbolic or metaphorical interpretation. It is something that actually occurred in the narrative. Constraint number 2, the flood serves a theological purpose. So it wasn't just any big flood that happened because of an asteroid or a comet hitting the earth or some sort of glacial bridge melting, but it had a theological purpose that communicates something essential about God, humanity, and judgment in the broader biblical story. Constraint number 3, the narrative is presented in universal terms. The language consistently reinforces a scope that includes words like all, the whole, or every, even where narrower meanings are contextually possible. We spoke a lot about that last week and the week before. Constraint number 4. Flood accounts exist in broader ancient context. The presence of other flood traditions suggests that Genesis is engaging with a shared cultural memory rather than operating in isolation. Constraint number 5. Consistency of divine revelation. When it comes to God revealing himself in the different ways that he does that, any interpretation must preserve continuity in God's dealings with humanity. It should not imply that modern readers possess a decisive advantage over ancient people and vice versa. Constraint number 6. A presupposed narrative world. The text assumes familiarity with additional narrative context. Certain events are referenced without explanation, suggesting the existence of side narratives or shared knowledge that are now mostly lost to time and can only be cautiously reconstructed or speculated. One example of text that may still exists and is not lost to time is the book of Enoch, but that is again not a authoritative book. Okay, so in the end of last week I brought up 2 premises. Premise number 1, humans existed outside the garden. So remember, a premise is like a constraint. It's weaker, but it's still founded on several biblical verses, for instance. The text allows for the existence of humans prior to and outside the placement of Adam in the garden. These populations may have existed for extended periods and could have developed in ways consistent with the natural world or under God's sovereignty. The idea is that the text talks about Cain being fearful of people who were outside the garden when there should have only been 3 humans at that time. If you go literally by the biblical narrative, you could say literally, according to the text, there were other people outside the garden. Now, where did they come from? Well, according to Genesis chapter 1, they were created at the second part of the sixth day of creation. That God created humanity in his image, male and female, he created them. It appears, though, that God created these humans outside the garden, maybe for hundreds of thousands of years before he decided to create Adam as an adult and put him in this new garden that he also created. Now, premise number 2, I want to bring up a slide here. All right, so I did present premise number 2 at the end of last week's episode, but I've expanded it and created some subpoints, and so I don't think I'm really adding anything to it, but I am being more explicit about what it entails. So premise number 2, Adam and Eve's line or lineage is inheritable and distinct. This distinction arises from their unique formation. So Adam was formed from the dirt, from the ground, as an adult and placed in the garden. And then later on, we see Eve being created from Adam's side and also from some more dirt, I assume. So it arises from their unique formation, but also from their access to these two very special trees that existed nowhere else on the earth. So we have the tree of life, which was able to extend someone's life for indefinite periods. And it also had the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God did not want them to eat from, at least not at that exact moment, but which they did eat from. And that would give them some sort of miraculous knowledge that God, at that point, only he had. And then they would get that knowledge of good and evil, but they wouldn't be able to comprehend it or handle it. So subpoint for premise number 2, a distinct genealogical line. Adam and Eve represent a unique line within humanity, with characteristics passed down through their descendants. You can assume that that is some sort of genetic inheritance. I don't know how you pass down some sort of long lifespan that you got from eating from a tree. We don't know how these things work. There's definitely some mystery to it. But we see that not only did Adam and Eve live for a very long time, but also so did their descendants. And I would argue that humans outside the garden did not live these long periods of time. They just lived the regular lifespans that we're accustomed to. The genealogical focus of Genesis suggests continuity and significance tied specifically to this line, because we see this line not only followed to Noah, but we see it followed to Abraham and then to David and Moses, or I should say to Moses and then David and then to the Messiah. Extended lifespan and physical vitality. This line is marked by unusually long lifespans. And remember, we talked about that they not only lived longer, but their entire lifespan was stretched out. So they reached puberty and started having children and aged all at longer periods of time, often exceeding 900 years, possibly connected to access to the tree of life, suggesting a physical robustness not seen in later humanity. Now, one of the reasons why I thought that this might be connected to the tree of life is that not only was the knowledge of good and evil transferable to their offspring, as we see in Genesis chapter 4, but that then whatever they gained from eating from the tree of life, which we can presume they ate from before they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that is part of this. So it wasn't seen in the existing humanity outside the garden, nor do we see it in modern times. Okay, unique moral awareness and accountability. By eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, this line carries a distinct form of moral awareness. The text presents this as transformative and consequential, introducing a level of divine moral knowledge. Remember, that was what was enticing to them, and what the serpent used to get Eve to eat from the tree was that you will be more like God, knowing good and evil. So introducing a level of divine moral knowledge that brings direct accountability before God and defines what constitutes evil from his perspective. Offspring and line interaction. Offspring produced by this line and ordinary humans produced the Nephilim. We see that in Genesis chapter 6. If we presume that Adam and Eve and their offspring, direct offspring, were what were referred to as the sons of God, then the daughters of men would be the ordinary humans, the daughters of ordinary humans, and then when they have offspring, then it produced these Nephilim. They were unusual and extraordinary individuals who appeared to reflect aspects of both lines. At the same time, unions within the Adamic line preserve its continuity. So we know that Adam and Eve had daughters. It's a little bit weird to think about, Seth marrying one of his sisters, but of course it was very different back then. They were very special in their line. And so it seems as though that they were not meant to have offspring with regular humans like Cain did, but that they were meant to stay within the line. So at the same time, unions within the Adamic line preserve its continuity as seen in the genealogical emphasis leading to Noah. Language and narrative compression. The text primarily uses a single term, often translated man or human, which comes from the Hebrew word Adam, to describe multiple groups. Only in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, do we see the text really trying to use different titles like the sons of God and the daughters of men and Nephilim to try to describe these different groups. Otherwise, it just uses this word human, and sometimes it uses the word for flesh. This creates ambiguity, making it difficult to distinguish between ordinary humans, the Adamic line, and their mixed hybrid offspring without relying on context. This compression parallels the universal language described in constraint number 3. So if you remember constraint number 3, about how they would just the translators had to bake in a meaning, actually have some sort of interpretation when they have multiple words to choose from that fit the context. They will use the word like it was all over the earth, or it hadn't rained all over the earth, when the word could have meant region or the land. Constraint number 3, where broad terms are used even when more specific distinctions may exist. I don't know if I finished this one, but let me just make sure I point this out in this unique moral awareness. Introducing a level of divine moral knowledge that brings direct accountability before God and defines what constitutes evil from his perspective. So humans are evil, even the ordinary ones. But what was special about Adam and Eve is they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so that makes them accountable for the bad that they do. Things like murdering his brother. That's really what I mean by evil. It's kind of hard to split hairs here, but evil differentiates just from bad by the moral knowledge that one has. All right, so let's go to speculation number 1. We've got 5 speculations to go through. So let's go through these quickly and we'll cover them in more detail next week. Speculation number 1, and a speculation is a weaker form of a premise, which is a weaker form of a constraint. So I realize that these are speculative. Speculation number 1, the garden remained until the time of Noah. No explicit record of its destruction. The text never states that the garden was destroyed or removed from the earth. In fact, what we see in Genesis chapter 3 is that it's explicitly preserved, though it is made inaccessible by cherubim with flaming swords. So this prevented access, but doesn't imply its elimination, at least not at that point. So we don't know how long the garden lasted for, but we know that we can't find it today. The narrative continuity favors persistence. In the absence of any statement of removal, like God removed the man, guarded it for a while, and then burned it down or something like that. It doesn't say that. The simplest reading is that the garden continued to exist as a real, though inaccessible, location. Okay, speculation number 2. The Adamic line remained near the garden. Now, nothing in the text requires the Adamic line to disperse across the whole earth this early in the story. So a simple reading may be that they remain near where the story began, just outside the garden. Geographic continuity with its original setting. The text never indicates that Adam and Eve or their immediate descendants, besides Cain, who we'll talk about, left the region associated with the garden. It is therefore plausible that the early Adamic line remained in that general vicinity, even while being barred from re-entry. Now, Cain's departure marks a separation. In contrast, Cain is explicitly described as leaving that region, Genesis chapter 4, verse 16, and establishing life elsewhere. This suggests a geographic and possibly relational separation from the Adamic line. Marriage outside of the Adamic line. Cain's wife is introduced without explanation, which is consistent with the existence of other human populations. That's from premises number 1. This supports the idea that his descendants developed outside the primary Adamic lineage as Nephilim. That's premise number 2. So he married somebody. It doesn't say anything about them having daughters yet. It does say that they had daughters, but just not yet. It's very specific to talk about their first 2 children, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. There are no other children. He gets kicked out, not just outside of the garden, but he gets exiled from even there beyond that. And then he finds a wife who's a regular human, an ordinary human. Development of a distinct line outside of the garden region. Cain's descendants are associated with early city building and cultural development, which may reflect a divergence from the Adamic line that remained closer to the original narrative focus. No clear distinction is implied. Now, remember that Cain needed a sign to be put on him. We don't know what it was, but something that would show to these other humans that he's going to that he was special and protected by God. So the need for a sign placed on Cain, that's in Genesis chapter 4, verse 15, suggests that he was not inherently distinguishable from ordinary humans. This indicates that any difference between the groups were not outwardly obvious. So it'd be difficult for a person just to see somebody and go, wow, you must be a couple hundred years old. But we know that this idea of the Nephilim and perhaps even the Adamic line were giants. That idea didn't come until later and was broadly based on the book of Enoch, which we know is pseudepigraphal and not authoritative. All right, speculation number 3. The garden animals were distinct and required preservation. So they had a separate formation. We've talked about this in episode 2, I believe. Genesis chapter 2 presents the animals brought to Adam as specially formed in connection with the garden narrative, much like Adam himself is specially formed and placed there, considered as possible helpers. These animals are presented in the search for a suitable helper for Adam, suggesting they were not ordinary animals in the way modern readers typically imagine them. The serpent as evidence of unusual capacity. The serpent is able to reason, speak, deceive, and manipulate, implying that at least some garden creatures possessed capacities beyond ordinary animals. And I would say they probably all were different than ordinary animals, and part of that has to do with the fact that it says what was special about the serpent was that he manipulated and deceived, not that he could speak. Therefore, preservation mattered. If the garden contained a distinct class of animals and birds tied to that original sacred environment, then preserving them through the flood becomes more understandable. In this model, the ark is not preserving just ordinary birds and animals on the earth, like in the Americas, for instance, but distinct living creatures associated with the garden world that was being judged, reset, and carried forward through Noah. All right, speculation number 4. The garden may have required removal as a part of the flood. So we think about humans being destroyed by the flood, but what about the garden? A preserved but vulnerable boundary. The garden is described as guarded and inaccessible. That's Genesis 3:24. But as human populations, both Adamic and ordinary, increased, which the Bible is clear to indicate in Genesis 5 and 6, maintaining a permanent separation may have become increasingly difficult. Now, of course, God could, employ more cherubims and so forth, but that involves increased spiritual awareness and miracles to these ordinary humans. So the idea that God could keep this garden a secret and away from all the ordinary humans becomes more and more difficult. Problem of proximity. If the Adamic line remained near the garden, that's from the speculation number 2, then over time the risk of renewed access to the tree of life and to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil may have grown. I don't know if it was important that they couldn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil anymore. It probably wasn't. I don't think they would gain more knowledge or something like that. But it was, as it's mentioned in Genesis chapter 3, it was very important that they stay away from the tree of life. So if they were living just outside the garden, then how long can God keep them out through some angels with flaming swords? Integration with the flood event. So this raises the possibility that the flood was not only a judgment on humanity, but also a means of removing and resetting the original sacred environment. That's where the title comes from, Garden 2.0. So the idea is that the post-flood world now is the Garden 2.0. It's not the Garden 1.0, which was very special, had these special trees and so forth that you could get knowledge and extra life from. But the idea that the post-flood world could then become the Garden 2.0 as the Adamic line through Noah and his sons now goes out and populates the world. Not populates them originally, but goes to with where the other humans are. Okay, let's see. A miraculous mechanism that fits the scope. A flood uniquely removes both population and landscape while still allowing for the preservation through the ark. So you have to think, why did God use a flood? He could have done all kinds of things. Unlike localized judgment, like plagues and fire and hail, we see with the Egyptians, it operates at a scale sufficient to eliminate access to a specific region or environment while carrying forward what God intends to preserve. You can think of all kinds of other miraculous things that God did to destroy people, like he allowed the Jewish people to escape through the Red Sea, but then it collapsed on the Egyptians that followed them. Or you can think of like after Achan's sin, where the sand opened up and ate him and his family. So that was something that was big enough to engulf Achan and his family, but not take anybody else. Provision and material connections. So this is important. The gathering of provisions, that's like food for the animals and for Noah and his sons and their wives. That's a lot of food for a year. So where would that come from? Well, it could come from the garden. And also there's this idea of gopher wood, which is some sort of lost to time species of wood that would be consistent with resources originating from or near a unique environment, though the specifics are not preserved in the text. So this word gopher, I don't know, I thought it had something to do with gophers or something. What I found, though, is that this is actually a transliterated Hebrew word that sounds like gopher. This is notable as Hebrew contains as many as 20 specific words for hardwood tree species, such as like cedar and cypress. In the current NIV translation, it actually translates, I would say interprets the word for gopher, which they don't know what it is. There is a little hyperlink saying that it is uncertain, but it translates it as cypress wood. But there was a Hebrew word for cypress wood, and there was a Hebrew word for cedars, like the cedars of Lebanon. So this is suggesting that this material may have been unfamiliar, specialized, or no longer recognized in later periods. Okay, speculation number 5. The flood waters originated from the same source that sustained the garden. So now we're thinking about, where did the water come from? So a pre-existing water source is described in detail, in great detail, in Genesis chapter 2. It describes water welling up to water the garden and forming the headwaters of 4 different rivers. That's a lot of water. These are 4 major rivers, 2 of which remain to this day, indicating a significant and possibly unique source of water. So consistent with a distinct environment, if the garden was a unique and localized environment, you can look at speculations 1 through 4, it is plausible that its water system was also distinct and could play a role in the flood event, especially that since the flood lasted for a whole year. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, which is a lot of water, but that's not enough water. The water will maybe well up, and it does take time to spread out across the surface of the earth and maybe go down rivers into the oceans. But how does it stay welled up for a whole year? Well, it has to have some sort of a source, like a spring. And so that could be that. So a mechanism already embedded in the narrative. Rather than introducing an entirely new source, this model allows the flood to emerge from an existing feature described earlier in Genesis and explain why, or give a reason as to why it is described in so much detail earlier in Genesis. Integration with flood language. This may align with the descriptions, such as fountains of the deep, that comes from Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, was an additional source to the rain, suggesting a release or expansion of pre-existing water systems. So if the same system that sustained the garden also became the source of the flood, then the beginning and reset of the world may be more closely connected than we've ever considered. And I don't know if I should have put world there because that's doing what the Hebrew translators, I think, did. But this region, it would explain how the flood could have destroyed the garden because all these floods just suddenly went into turbo mode and started gushing out water and destroying all of the trees, especially the two special trees, and then also would then quickly destroy those who were living right next to the garden. So that's a lot for today. Lots of speculations, but I believe they're all within the constraints, surprisingly. And I had a difficult time even actually putting this together because even I was thinking like, wow, this is very speculative. But these ideas kept on coming to me. And as I explored the text further and thought more about it, they all seemed to kind of come together. So next week, we'll go over these speculations again, especially since I had to cover them so quickly. But we'll apply them directly to Genesis chapter 6 through 8. And one thing we haven't talked about is when this has happened. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a great evening.